Jimmy D and the Wolf Podcast. Here we are once again in the same room.
Yes. Feels so good.
Yeah.
I'm excited to be back in Nashville.
Yes.
And be hanging out with you. Wolf Creek Studios, man. This is good.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So we did, I think, 3 of them remotely. At least 3.
Which was a lot of effort for you because you had to hold my hand and guide me through the whole process.
Using Zoom. And
no,
hopefully
Jimmy.
now we're using pro level microphones. The audio should be better. And hope you guys see the difference.
Yeah, they will. I'm sure.
So we were talking earlier about a story that maybe would be interesting to talk about, and that is Vincent Van Gogh, and he's my favorite painter. And in 2018, I did a Vincent Van Gogh tour. I started by going to New York, and I went to see at the Museum of Modern Art. I saw Starry Night. Actually, the name of the painting is Starry Night, but anyone familiar with the Don McLean song, Starry Night, was how he sang it. And I was able to get right up to it and take a picture next to it. I'll post that in the video. And then I went to Europe, and I went to Arles, France, where he spent some time, and actually where he convalesced after he cut his ear off. And it's still in very good condition. And there's also a place where you can walk and take a walking tour and see. They have a little plaque which showed where the view he was when he painted a particular painting. There's like a dozen of them. It's very instructive to see the actual grounds where he was and where he painted. But his most famous painting, Starry Night, of course, he only sold one painting in his lifetime, which he sold to his brother, who was an art dealer. And the inspiration for me as a songwriter, sometimes it's easy to say, maybe nobody's ever going to hear my songs. Why do I keep going? But Van Gogh didn't let that stop him. He was incredibly prolific. His brother was an art dealer, and he would send his paintings like 20 at a time to his brother, who was back in the Netherlands, and he was in France most of the time, Paris, then Arles, and another city in the south of France. And he would send the paintings to his brother and write copious letters. And I have the collection of all his letters. It's a 3-volume piece, which I showed you. Mm-hmm. And his brother always wrote back, but unfortunately, Vincent didn't save letters. Theo did. So we don't have very many of Theo's letters because Vincent threw them away. But Theo saved all of Vincent's letters, so we have, I think, all of them, and they got published. But the point is, for a songwriter, for me anyway, is that Vincent was very prolific. He was putting on like 20 paintings a month, which, if you think about that's just, the guy's working like 12 hours a day.
Well, you made a great point. Like, a whole painting and a song are 2 different worlds. To put out 20 songs in a month is one thing.
And that'd be very difficult to do.
That'd be really, that's super prolific as a writer. 20 paintings?
Yeah. And he just kept working, and his brother, who was a huge resource for him because he was in the art world and was a dealer, could give him professional comments. And he just kept going. And he was greatly influenced by Japanese ukiyo-e wood block prints, and he had over 500 of them hung up in his studio. They were inexpensive, and we talked about Japan being closed off the world for 300 years, the Edo period. We talked about the Samurai Code and the 47 Ronin, and which is a true story in the early 1700s. And Japan opened up to the world about 1855 roughly. And so Van Gogh's painting all these paintings in the 1880s. He died in 1890. So the 10 years before that was shortly after Japan had opened up to the world. And everybody wanted to know about what was going on in Japan. I mean, Puccini wrote an opera about the Modern Butterfly, which was written in that time period, and everybody was fascinated with this exotic culture that nobody knew about. And they had, of course, the World's Fairs. Eiffel Tower was built for one of those, which was all the rage in Paris and in the world. And so these ukiyo-e woodblock prints were something that became common knowledge. And he was living in Paris at the time, and he had over 500 of them. I think he had 550 of them. And they showed some of them that he had tacked, even showed the tack mark where he tacked them to the wall. And he used them as studies. And that's one of the reasons why his work was so different, because he used inspiration. So we worked hard. I mean, he just really worked at his craft, got no success while he was alive, but somehow he found the motivation. And he dealt with mental illness on top of that.
Yes.
He just think of how much more he could have done if he didn't have to deal with all the mental illness.
Yeah. Well, you brought up an interesting point that sometimes, and this is way too prevalent with people's perception of artists, that there are many people that say he was great because of his mental illness. This drives me insane, because I've heard forever, ever since I got into music and really started getting into guitar, people would say Hendrix was uber creative and incredibly innovative guitar player because of the drug use. No, he was all those things in spite of. Much like Van Gogh, he wasn't great because he was insane. He was great in spite of his illness.
And that was my number one takeaway when I did this trip, and I went to Amsterdam, the Van Gogh Museum. So I went to Arles, and I'd had and I saw the building, like the yellow house where he lived, and there's a cafe, and of course they know that Arles, the biggest draw for anyone to go to Arles for tourists, is because of Van Gogh was there. So they've kept a lot of these buildings the same. And in fact, you can see there's one of a yellow with a canopy and the yellow cafe, and they've renamed it Cafe Van Gogh. That wasn't the name back then, of course. And then the building where he lived, the apartment where Gauguin came to visit him, and he had a troublesome relationship with Gauguin. And so it was just instructive. And then go to Paris, and there's some Van Goghs in the Louvre. We went to the Louvre, but then where you really get the treasure trove was when you go to Amsterdam and the Van Gogh Museum. And it was interesting to me, because I've been to a lot of museums. I love to go to museums. You just go. And I didn't realize you need an appointment to go to the Van Gogh Museum. It's not that big, and you just can't walk up and go. And I had not planned for that. It was the highlight of my trip. It was the main reason I went to Europe. And so I said, I want to get a ticket. Oh, we're sold out today, sir. What? You have to make an appointment. Well, when can I get an appointment? And it wasn't until I had my schedule all planned out, and I had Airbnbs, and the next place I was going to go was Berlin. And I literally postponed my trip. I stayed an extra night in Amsterdam in an absolutely horrible flea bag hotel. It was horrible. It was like 5 flights of stairs. And I remember staying there. The guy checking in was really angry and not happy dealing with all the tourists. Anyway, so I could get a ticket so I could go in. I had 2 days out. I could get a ticket to go in, and that was my main reason. So I actually paid for one Airbnb in Berlin that I didn't use. I texted them and said I'm not going to be coming until the next day. Of course, I had to pay for it. So, but my main reason for going to Europe was to see this museum, and it was worth it. There was at least 2 times when I stood in front of one of his works, and I literally started crying.
Wow.
The emotion that he brought to the canvas. And coincidentally, they had an unlimited, sometimes museums will have special exhibitions. And I was so fortunate because I lived in Japan and I love Japan. They had the special exhibition that was only on for like a few months that was Van Gogh and the Japanese culture. And so a lot of the stuff I learned about how he took everything from the woodblock prints was a special exposition that was only on for the summer for a few months. And I bought a book from that special exposition that a lot of like the wood prints that he had that actually were his, that still had the thumb hole in them, where he had them thumbtack hole where he put them on the wall of his studio. They showed some of those, and they talked about how he learned from Japanese print. Anyway, so yeah, Van Gogh, deep dive. But the point that I wanted to make, and that I took away from it, just the other day I was reading about Starry Night. It's the most famous painting probably of Van Gogh's, and he thought it was a failure. He didn't like it. He said the swirls were too big, for one thing, because if you remember, the swirls in the sky are pretty large. And he wrote letters to Theo talking about that painting, and he said, I'm not really that happy with this painting. And it's now his most famous work. Sunflowers, he's famous for sunflowers, and he's also famous for some self-portraits, but I think the most famous one would be Starry Night. Which one do you know of?
It's Starry Night. It's the most famous
And
one.
he thought it was a failure. So it's interesting as a songwriter and as an artist, you don't know what's going to resonate with people, and you just have to keep going. I mean,
that's the whole thing. Like, his generation never picked up on him, and he's widely heralded as one of, if not the greatest.
Certainly from that era, certainly from the Impressionist era. I think he's the most famous, and partially because of his tragic story, of cutting his ear off, part of his ear off, sending it to the girl who's a prostitute that he was in love with. I mean, that was because he had voices. He had mental issues, and he knew it, and he checked himself into the insane asylum, and he painted Starry Night from the window of the insane asylum. While he was there weren't very many people there, so he actually was able to get 2 rooms, one to sleep in and one to work in. And that's where he painted. He was so prolific, dealing with mental illness in an insane asylum, and he's pumping out paintings like nothing.
That's the thing. I mean, do you think he did it because he had to do it? Do you think he had any inclination of his greatness?
Well, I haven't buckled down and read a lot of these letters. I mean, I bought them with the intent of it, but I just haven't had the time haven't taken the time to dedicate to that. But I've read some excerpts, and he was very well spoken, the way he wrote about his art, and very opinionated about some other art practices that other art people were doing. So he was confident in what he liked and what he was trying to accomplish. Did he think he be revered as one of the... I mean, if you took 100 people off the street and asked them who's the most famous painter, I'd venture to say at least 50%, or who's the 3 most famous painters in the history of the world, I would venture to say that half of them would mention Van Gogh.
Sure.
I would think. That'd be an interesting study to do. I mean, he's a very famous painter. Did he realize that would happen to him? I mean, I don't think so. He was trying to survive. I mean, Most of those guys, they were poor, and painting, it costs money for paint and canvas. That's expensive. And the only way that he could do it, because his brother sent him that stuff, because his brother was apparently well-to-do art dealer and had the money to supply him with what he needed. But he certainly didn't live... I mean, when he lived in Paris, he lived in a really inexpensive place. I mean, the Impressionist was going on at the time, and he was influenced by that as well. Although his work is somewhat impressionistic, but it also is a bit different. He put on paint so thickly with the palette knife. He did some things differently than some of the more mainstream Impressionists. And there's variety even with them. You got Renoir, very romantic, and then you've got Monet and then you got the pointillism with the dots. So there was a broad variety within Impressionists' work. Some doing landscapes, some doing stills, so some doing people like Renoir. Renoir is my second favorite painter from that time. You know, very romantic, usually a man and a woman dancing, or a room or outside cafe.
And what was the level of success he had while he was still alive?
You know, that's a good question. I'll have to look that up because I've never really followed up with like a Renoir tour. Maybe that'll be my next trip to Europe, a Renoir tour.
Well, you know, when you were telling me earlier about the letters, what resonated with me was I instantly thought of the Otis Redding song "Sitting on the Dock of the Bay," because that was, in my mind, the greatest soul singer ever. And his biggest hit that we know of is "Sitting on the Dock of the Bay." He never knew that song was successful at all. It was written at the end. And it's this microcosm of his life because he's singing about how he really hadn't accomplished anything. And every time I sing that song, man, it's like, you know, most people think of it as a happy song and it gets requested a lot. And every time I do it, it's like, you gotta take a deep breath because you think about that thing of like, man, Otis, I can feel him sitting on the dock and being like, man, I struck out, you know, I tried as hard as I could and I just never really got there. It's interesting how many brilliant artists are light years ahead of their time, and it sounds like that was definitely the case with Van Gogh. But that's why I asked the question, you know, did he do it because he had to do it? It was so much a part of him that he just had to do. He just had to paint. If he wouldn't have painted, he would have played in it. He would have done something artistic.
Well, when he was a pastor at the beginning, he was actually a pastor, preacher, when he was in his early 20s, and so he didn't come up from the time he was like 12 or 8 or whatever.
Yeah.
I gotta paint. He came on to a little bit later, I think, in life, and bounced from thing to thing, and he found it a little bit later in life. But I think once he found it, he obviously was obsessed by it, by the letters that he wrote, and all the letters are about painting and about what other people are doing and what he likes about what they're doing, what they're not doing, and what he's trying to accomplish. And his brother was a great resource for that because his brother was an art dealer and knew what was happening, and so without his brother, he wouldn't have been the painter that he was, because he wouldn't have had materials, for one thing.
And nobody would have ever known because the letters wouldn't have been there.
Right. Well, I don't know, did I say that? I think I told you earlier, but I don't think I said it in this podcast. So he died in his 30s, and his brother Theo died 6 months after he died. His brother Theo was quite ill, had illness. And Theo's wife, his widow, became the caretaker of all the paintings and the letters that Theo had. They were in a drawer, and she went through them. And based on my recollection, now a few paintings got sold, and there was some interest, but it wasn't to the level that it is today. And she had all those letters published. And Vincent Van Gogh became famous first because of all the letters. And it was after that people became interested in his paintings. So
it's amazing.
Yeah.
So we never would have known.
So she, Theo's widow, really championed him. And without her, would we know? Would he have become as famous as he has become?
Vincent Van Gogh, the famous letter writer. That's something, man. Hang on to your letters. That's the moral of the story.
Yeah.
Hang on to that stuff.
And the ones that Theo wrote, there's few. I think it's like probably 10 to 1. You know, there's a few surviving. Maybe he made a copy or something, you know, by copying by a longhand. They didn't have copy machines then. But there are a few, and there's a few others in the book that weren't written by either one of them. They were written by that is pertinent to the subject matter. So I'll need to block out some time to go through the volume.
Well, the real takeaway from it for me is that I think the lesson to learn there is if you're creating art or anything really, just because it's not successful right now doesn't mean it isn't great.
Right.
And that's one of the most important things that all artists can hang on to. And Van Gogh, that's what more proof is there than that of his life story. A man, 20 paintings a month and a brilliant artist, and we never would have known who he was had his brother's wife not held on to the letters. And Van Gogh became introduced to the world as this great writer of letters to his brother. I mean, that's something that a lot of people should take to heart. That's a great story, man. I love how it connects to writing, especially. And, it's across the board with so many great artists that he was influenced by Japanese box art, right? And who would have made that connection? Much like how many artists have passed from the blues world. Like Peter Green wasn't widely heralded as a brilliant guitar player until after he kind of had his own issues. And what were his influences? They were American blues. I mean, the way that all those things, those universes collide, it's fascinating to me that
Peter Green went he had mental issues, and based on what I read, he actually pulled a gun on his agent when his agent brought him a check, and he didn't want to have anything to do with the material goods, and he said, "Don't you be giving me money."
Right.
Have you heard that story?
Yes, I have. But a brilliant player, and there it comes back to that thing of, and this has always driven me insane, that there's so many people that say, great suffering makes great art. We don't want the artists thriving. Keep them.
And suffering. I believe that the model for that, number one model, is Van Gogh.
Sure. And now there's so many people with that idea that will say, well, Peter Green was brilliant because he suffered from mental illness. Hendrix was brilliant because he did so many drugs. Jim Morrison was brilliant because of all the drugs. The late 60s, the music was great because of all the drugs. Pink Floyd was great because Syd Barrett had all these issues. All those things happen in spite of all those things.
Yes, yeah.
But there's a widely accepted way of thinking to it. And it's terrible.
Stevie Ray actually believed in himself. He thought, how am I going to play? Once he got clean, he almost died, and he got clean from alcohol primarily.
Right, and blew that last album up. So he was just, for all his greatness, he was just getting started.
Absolutely. But he was afraid that he couldn't play without the alcohol. How am I going to play without it?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, man. That's why that way of thinking bothers me so much, because it's accepted. There's no other profession in the world, in the history of humanity, where they say, suffer. It's good for you. Suffer. You'll be better at what you do. Pour alcohol on it. Give him cocaine. Shoot him full of heroin. He'll be better at what he does. No, dude. There's no other line of work in the world where that applies. Nobody's ever went up to a construction worker and been like, you know what you should do? You should drink 7 shots of whiskey before you start working.
Well, interesting. I mean, another line of great artists are authors, and many authors, the best authors, were alcoholics and had drug issues. There's especially, I think, where it's assumed that if you're going to be great at what you do, another art form, you're going to have to be alcoholic. You're going to have to be troubled. But now the model for at least musical artists, a lot of them don't want to. I mean, they're all about their body. They're all about being healthy. A lot of them are vegan. A lot of them are vegetarian.
Stay in great shape.
And they have, they got a Peloton at the back of the bus, which is the hottest thing now, and they, stay in great condition. They don't have Keith Richards genes.
Yeah. Well, look at Mick, man. Mick just had a heart attack, right?
That I didn't hear.
Wasn't it like
yeah. But he was back on the road in like 35 days.
Yeah, basically doing somersaults on stage and stuff.
I saw him, yeah. I saw him after he had the heart attack. That's right, I'd forgotten, but I got rescheduled. It was supposed to have been in April, and it was in July. And I showed you some of the videos. He's dancing, he's singing, full 2-hour concert. Mm-hmm. And I think I said this to you, I couldn't imagine him being any better at any time in his career.
Right.
He was so off the hook amazing. Now, Keith, I don't think he was even in the mains. We talked about this. He looked like he didn't know where he was.
Yeah.
I've been Googling for anyone writing about this, but they're keeping it. He literally looked like he didn't know where he was.
Yeah, it's that whole mindset of we make stars bigger than life. And from that, we say they're indestructible. And that's why the bulk of our population is truly rattled when a star passes. You know, an inventor passes or politicians like, oh, so-and-so passed away. When a star, you know, a musical star or an artist, the whole country stops and goes, oh, so-and-so passed. It's because we have that imagery of them just being bigger than life, like they're invincible. And I think it feeds into that mindset of, you know, people think they can do all those things forever and they're never going to affect them. But the fact of the matter is they have to work twice as hard to stay in shape to try to live longer. It's an impossible, it's a conundrum for artists, I think at least. It's interesting, man. I didn't know we'd end up on that subject. That was a great place to start, Van Gogh. Because it totally it's the same thing, man. Still the same thing, almost 200 years later. Doesn't make great art, you know.
Yeah, cocaine has been around a long time. I mean, you know, they had cocaine back, you know, I wonder, like Mozart. Mozart died in his 30s. I don't know if he... You know, even if they had drug use back then. Well, what else you want to talk about?
That's something that we should look into. See who started that whole trend. Was it Mozart? Was Mozart doing drugs? Was he the original drugs and rock and roll guy? How far does that go back, man? You know what I mean? Mozart can't do his...
Have you seen the clip? Have you seen the clip? Yeah, it was Beethoven. It was pretend like an A&R guy came to see Beethoven. Have you seen that clip?
No.
And he's trying to write. You know, he's writing. What's the fifth? Da 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 da. Is that the fifth? I think that's the fifth.
Yeah, Beethoven's fifth.
That's fifth. And he's working on that, and the A&R guy likes that part, or no. And then it goes faster after that, and he says he only likes the fast part. And he said, loop that. Oh, it's just a hilarious video. And Beethoven is going absolutely crazy because the A&R guy is trying to get him to completely redo it. And he says, only want the fast part. Everybody wants tempo. So do that part and just loop it over and over.
It's so true, man. It's so true that, like, if Beethoven was alive today with all of his incredible music and took it to A&R people in the music business, they would say, we're going to take these 4 bars of your song and we just want you to do that for 3 minutes.
Yeah, so, well, you can't blame them. I mean, they're looking in a rearview mirror.
Sure.
There are what worked before.
Yeah,
let's do it again.
It's not forward thinking anymore, and they can't afford for it to be forward thinking because they're...
And movies are the same way. The movies are the same way. That's why, how many sequels can you possibly make of any subject that is...
man, Netflix, dude, every day, not every day because I don't watch TV every day, but every time I turn on Netflix, it will say Netflix #1 movie, and they'll have like 1 through 10 on Netflix, and they make the same movie over and over and over. Sometimes I'll turn it on and get 10 minutes in and be like, okay, I know the middle section of this is going to look like. I know how the movie's going to end. I mean, there's only so many plots they can use.
Well, what was one with Wahlberg in it? Spencer or something?
Right.
Spencer?
Yeah, a cop from Boston. Imagine that. Mark Wahlberg playing a cop.
Like, that's never been done before. But I was happy to see Post Malone do his scene in the
me too.
In the prison library.
Man, he did a Nirvana thing.
Yeah, I haven't seen that yet, but you said he killed it.
He killed it, dude. He killed it. I was really, really impressed with how good it was. So when I first saw it, I thought, this isn't going to be that good.
No, he played guitar in bands back in the day. I mean, in Texas. I think isn't he from Texas?
I'm not sure.
His first, he auditioned and got into a band playing guitar. I mean, so it's not like he can't play guitar.
He killed it.
I mean, was he playing rhythm or I haven't seen it yet.
He had another guy playing guitar too. It was mostly rhythm, and it's Nirvana stuff, but I was just impressed because he was doing early Nirvana stuff. I mean, it was a deep dive. It was like an hour-long show. He didn't just play hit Nirvana songs. He like dug into their catalog. He played stuff off of Bleach, and it's funny, man. You know, I remember everybody loving Nirvana when I was in high school. Not everybody, but before they were very popular. This is another thing that happens. We've discussed this before. Of now people want to feel like they found something that's their own kind of thing. When I was in school, in high school in, late 80s, early 90s, the skater kids knew about Nirvana, and the punk rock kids knew about Nirvana and loved them. But Nirvana wasn't very big. It's kind of like an underground thing. And then they got really, really big with Nevermind. It Smells Like Teen Spirit. They blew up. They were the biggest band in the world. And the craziest thing happened. All the other kids in school loved them, but the skater kids and the punk kids all of a sudden hated them because they were popular. And that's a whole flip side of it. And I only bring that up because I've never understood it. I have no idea what's going on there psychologically. And I've seen it happen over and over.
Well, you want to be, I suppose you want to be hip, so you want to be consuming and liking things that nobody else knows about. It's the same, I hate to say it, but it's the same mentality as conspiracy theories.
Sure.
If you believe, you wear the tinfoil hats, metaphorically speaking, and you know this secret that it's a conspiracy that nobody else knows, you feel superior. Right. That's what people that really are big proponents of serial conspiracy theory believers, which there are. We've talked about this.
Sure.
There are people like that, and part of the motivation is they feel like they are in on something and they realize something that the average populace doesn't know, and makes you. It helps your self-esteem. I would think it's the same type of mechanism working around people who love a band before anyone else knows them, and then once they become popular and the common people know who they are, well, then I need to find the next thing that is really cool before anyone else finds it, because I got to be that hip, cool person.
Can't listen to the same music as the sheep. It's an interesting phenomenon, man. I'd like to know what that's going to look like for some of the new artists,
Well, music is so I like to go on Quora, and sometimes I'll comment there, and people ask questions. So we talked about this a little bit, and people post questions, and sometimes it's leading questions, and it's all kinds of subjects. Sometimes political. I don't delve into the political for the most part, but why is Trump failing, or why is Trump the best president ever? Either side.
Sure.
And it's a leading question, right? You're already believing
absolutely
the answer, and you're just provoking. So there was this one, why is the music industry so uncreative? And there were probably 20 comments about how horrible the music industry is, and there's no Metallica. There'll never be another. The industry won't allow. The guy specifically talking about Metallica. There's no rock bands that are big, and I jumped in and I said, you got to be crazy. I said, this is the most fertile time for music in the history of the world. I mean, there are so many bands, mid-level bands that are making it, and there's no gatekeepers. There's no A&R guy.
Out there, man.
There's no A&R person that's holding anybody back, and there's no, like back in the day, the record you had to have a record deal because you needed the distribution, and you couldn't. To go into a record studio, you had to have major funding to spend the time necessary just to buy the tape.
Sure.
Just the tape. Because
Yeah.
you had to go on tape and you had to buy the physical tape. And just the tape budget alone, most people couldn't afford the tape, let alone the studio time.
Mm-hmm.
You had to have an engineer. It was
Sure.
and you had to have backing to literally do that. Now, unless you were an MIT engineer and you figured out how to do that, like Tom Schultz, built his own studio, built his own gear, but not everybody is an MIT
Sure.
best.
Well, now, you just need to spend 20 hours to learn a program and get a few $100 laptop.
So, yeah, but back then, so the gatekeepers and an A&R guy, and I don't think there were many A&R gals, but so you say they're the ones who decided, well, I'm not going to back you. There's a story, and I remember reading this, and I've been trying to find this story, but I haven't been able to find it, so maybe it's not necessarily true, but Bachman Turner Overdrive, Randy Bachman, who was in the Guess Who in Canada, great band, American Woman, and other great hits, and he's a guitar player. And he left because he couldn't get along with Burton Cummings, who was the keyboard player. And they're still feuding, I think, to this day. Anyway, he started a band, Bachman Turner Overdrive. And he'd had great success. He wrote American Woman. Randy Bachman wrote American Woman. American Woman.
Yeah.
And he still couldn't get a contract. And the story goes, and I don't remember where I heard this, and I would try to follow it up, that they said, if we can't get a contract by the end of this summer, we're going to quit because we're just not making it. And we're spending time spinning our wheels. And he had sent in a demo tape to a record company. And the A&R guy, it was August, and the guy was on vacation for the whole month of August. And he in Paris or France or somewhere. And he comes back, and all these tapes are on his desk. And he said, I ain't going to listen to these. And he goes like this, and he sweeps them all off the desk into a trash can. One of them didn't make it in the trash can. It hit the lip of the trash bucket, fell on the floor.
Wow.
He picks it up and looks at it. It was Bachman Turner Overdrive's demo tape. And he listened to it, and Bachman Turner Overdrive became significantly more successful. In the 70s, they were dominant.
Sure.
They had a couple albums and some big hits. Taking Care of Business, they had some big hits. And according to this story, and I've been trying to get the supporting information behind it, I haven't been able to find it, so maybe it's a made-up story. But that is about how it went. If the A&R guy didn't take a liking to you, you couldn't make it. So it was controlled.
Sure.
Now there is no control. Anybody can get their music out there. You had to have distribution. Even if you were Tom Schultz from Boston, and you were capable enough, and you had a great job where you could afford the gear and the tape, because he was an engineer for Polaroid. Tom Schultz was, so he had a great job in Boston, and he recorded the entire first album in his basement. But that's rare, very rare. Even if you could do that and you didn't have a record deal, you couldn't get distribution, because you had to have distribution to get your CDs or vinyl back then, vinyl into the record stores. So even if you could record it, you're not going to. So you need a record company regardless. They did have a record deal. And so the gatekeepers controlled everything. Now, there is no such thing. Anybody who has a computer can use Logic Pro or even GarageBand, or even there's free DAWs. Audacity is free, and you can record your own stuff and put it out on Spotify, and there's nobody to tell you can't. And so there's a lot of garbage out there, but you can get the distribution. So there's a lot of bands. And so anyway, I posted today, this is a golden age of music. There's so many different genres. or not being locked in. You don't have to get radio play to be successful. There are a lot of bands that aren't on the radio, that tour, and maybe they have Spotify listeners. And one guy responded and said, Tim, I've been in the record industry, and I've been a singer in the demo, and I've worked with people, and without the record labels to groom these people, they're just all Bush Junior League. And music is crap today, basically. And I'm like, I didn't respond. Because he believes that his belief pattern apparently seems to be that if it doesn't come through the dinosaur old school model of the record deal, record company grooming the artist and giving them instruction, that they can't be any good. I beg to differ.
Well, yeah, there's data there. Major labels aren't winning Grammys. Independent labels are winning Grammys. So he's wrong. There's data.
Little Nas, you can't argue with the guy because he'd say, well, that music's still crap. Little Nas X recorded he bought a beat from a guy in the Netherlands, $25, got it recorded, sleeping on his sister's couch, built 50 memes, worked really hard promoting it. He put out 50 TikTok memes. It blew up on TikTok, started getting some attention. It was number 20 or so on the Billboard country chart. Got kicked off the country chart. Got a lot of publicity by getting kicked off. Billy Ray Cyrus, and now a label's coming in at some point in time, but he's already got the success the time the label got involved. Billy Ray Cyrus gets involved, gets on it, they cut it, and now a label's involved, of course, and it becomes the biggest single ever in the history of the Billboard Hot 100. 19 weeks number one on the Hot 100. Label came in at the end, but there was no grooming of Lil Nas X.
There's no grooming anymore. That's why that guy's wrong. That model doesn't exist anymore. The labels aren't even letting people send A&R guys CDs. Labels say, oh, they're doing really well. That's successful.
Yes.
Let's hitch up
That's
with them.
Right. They're not grooming.
Try to give your CD to an A&R guy.
They want to see you succeeding first.
Right. You need X amount of likes. You need X amount of sales. You need X amount of shows or whatever their metric is. They all have different metrics. They're just giving you more backing.
But I'm thinking that this particular individual, he would probably still say, well, yeah, but that's still crap. Even though it did well and it was 19 weeks at number one, he would stay still mid-level, junior level artist because he didn't come through the grooming. He wouldn't care about the record being number one, because he said in his response, the music today is crap. So he's starting out already with that presumption, and I'm just assuming. I didn't respond because I didn't want to get into a pissing match, so to speak.
Yeah.
Excuse my language. Did we just go from PG to R-rated? I'm not sure.
NC-17 right there.
Anyway, I didn't want to get into that kind of a discussion, argument, because if you've decided that all the music today is all junior league, unless it came through a major label, there's nothing's going to change, because music is subjective anyway.
It's an asinine statement. All music today is garbage. There's no great music being made.
Just one example, Lake Street Dive. Lake Street Dive, I think they probably have a label. They're amazing, and all four of those are conservatory-trained musicians, but they're independent. They're not. There's no grooming by an artist. That's just one random example.
My response to the guy would have been, you've heard everything. All music is crap now. You've heard it all. Really? You've heard all? Because I guarantee that dude was still listening to his albums that he bought 20 years ago.
Could be.
There's a lot of great music out there now.
They won't have wasted any more of my time.
More than ever.
Should we wrap it up, Jimmy?
Let's wrap it up, man. I'm getting hungry.
Okay. All right.
Peace, everybody.
Jimmy D and the Wolf.
Jimmy D and the Wolf. See you next time.